Good afternoon, Year 11, and welcome today to your lesson on the Cold War topic to understand the Western reaction to Soviet expansion 1947 to 1951. So in this learning objective today, we're going to be looking at the Western reaction. So if we think of the West, we should know already that they are capitalist countries, and the main one we'll be looking at is the USA, as that is the superpower, but you could also be thinking about Britain and France, for example. And we want to kind of look at their reaction, so how they act after the Soviets expand their area. So if we're talking about Soviet expansion, we'll be talking about the USSR, so we'll be talking about Russia. And expansion means their growth. Now, if we're thinking about Soviet growth, we should know already that the USSR have grown, and they now have a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. And with a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe comes control over countries like Poland and Yugoslavia. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, how the West reacts to this communist expansion. So, we're going to be looking at two main reactions. So the Western reactions that we need to look at today are the following. And these are also inspired by previous actions. So if we look at this time period here, we're looking at 1947 to 1951. Now, if this had 1946 in it, because we've looked at a couple of Western reactions in 1946, so although this doesn't link to today's lesson, it links to our prior knowledge. So the West reacted in 1946 to Soviet expansion through the long telegram, which was from the US embassy in Moscow to the US government, warning them about the USSR, warning them they're spreading communism, warning them that the USSR didn't want war, but they saw the USA as the enemy, and Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which again warned about the expansion of the USSR, the expansion of communism. So if we now look at today's lesson, so 1947 to 1951, we're going to be looking at two things. We're going to be looking at something called the Truman Doctrine, and the Truman Doctrine is named the Truman Doctrine because Truman was the American president, and doctrine means kind of a set of beliefs. And he set out, really, his aim in this was to set out that he wants to contain communism, so stop it from spreading. And he then introduces something called the Marshall Plan. It's also known in some history textbooks as Marshall Aid. And this was the Truman Doctrine in action. It was the action of how to contain communism. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, and we're going to be using parts of the textbook to kind of fill in our knowledge about that. So let's start by looking then at the Truman Doctrine. So as I've already said, Truman is the American president at the time, and he's both had the former wartime leader Churchill, and he's had his own US government telling him that the USSR are a threat. He also believed that even from Potsdam. So he sets out his doctrine, his set of beliefs, a list of beliefs. And this was in 1947, so a year after the long telegram and the Iron Curtain speech. Probably a little bit less than a year when you look at months. But we can kind of say a year, because that's what we're going to be looking for. So in terms of what the doctrine says then, there's three key parts that Truman says, and it's all about communism. So it's about American policy towards communism. And we can see here that there's 3 bullet points. So he says communism poses a serious threat to the USA. The USA is going to support any country that's under the threat from communism, and the focus must be on containing communism. Now, for your top marks, you're going to want to know all 3, but the one I really want to stamp with you here and now is this 3rd one here. The focus must be on containing communism, okay? So keeping it within the countries where it was already established. So not destroying it completely, not pushing it all the way back to the USSR and freeing Eastern Europe, just not letting it spread. So no spread. So no spread to Western Europe. So again, containing, contain, those key words there. And the way that Truman does this is through the Marshall Plan, also known, as I've said previously, as the Marshall Aid, just Marshall Aid. And this is the Truman Doctrine in action. The Truman Doctrine being followed through. The Truman Doctrine being done. Containing communism. So again, the plan has 3 main aims. And for your top marks, you're going to want to know all 3 of these. So it needs to aid the economic recovery in Europe to stop people from turning to communism, supporting the containment of communism within Eastern Europe, and to create a market for American goods to build up the American economy, to make sure capitalism looks successful. But the sort of one I really want to stamp, because I think this is the most important, the one that leads to the others, is this top one here. And it's to aid economic recovery in Europe to stop people from turning to communism. Because this will allow capitalism, it will show, capitalism to work. And the way they're going to do this, to aid economic recovery, the Marshall Aid, the Marshall Plan, was to give money to countries to keep them capitalist, because if the society has lots of money, there is no need to turn to communism. And that then would if there's no need to turn to communism, that would lead to containment. And that would mean the Marshall Plan is successful, the Truman Doctrine is successful. So it would lead, it's not very clear, lead to containment. So, how did they go about actually doing this? Some key statistics we're going to want to stamp. $13.15 billion was given. I would just say just use 13 billion. Yeah, 13 billion is absolutely fine if you want to use that statistic. So $13 billion was given to countries across the world to keep them capitalist and to show that they are successful. It wasn't always through money though. It could have been done through machinery or farm work. So paying for that machinery, paying for farm work to get the economy going again. And the key example that I want you to stamp on here, there's probably 2 actually. There's West Germany, which they give 1.4 billion. And that's going to link to a future lesson. But the one from today that I really want to emphasise is Greece, which is where they give $694 million. And the reason I want to talk about Greece out of all these is because it gives us a really good case study to look at. So I'm going to write case study, the Greek Civil War. So a civil war is a war between the country. So in 1946, capitalists run Greece, but they were devastated by the war, the Second World War. As a result, they weren't doing very well economically. So, later in 1946, communists attempt a coup, a takeover. Which leads to the Civil War. As a result of this, Greece get Marshall aid from the Marshall Plan, so they get $694 million, sorry. And as a result of this, by 1949, capitalists win because they've got more support. And this is an example of containment. They have contained communism. They've stopped it from spreading to Greece. So they've stopped communism and the USSR's sphere of influence from growing.